Denise Ferreira de Silva. She's a professor and director of the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. She's also a visiting professor at the School of Law at Birkbeck University of London. She earned a BA in social sciences from the Universidad Federal de Rio de Janeiro and received a PhD in sociology from the University of Pittsburgh. And she has held many academic positions. I'll just name a few: at the University of California, San Diego, the University of Southern California, Monash University in Australia. And she's also the author of numerous articles, book chapters, a monograph entitled Toward a Global Idea of Race. She's also the co-editor of several volumes, including Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime with Paula Chakravarty. Her articles have appeared in numerous journals, including Social Text Theory, Culture and Society, Social Identities, Philosophia, Griffith Law Review, many more, as well as art publications such as Canadian Art, Text zur Kunst, and eFlux. I also want to highlight the fact that she is an artist as well as a philosopher and scholar, and her art practice includes poetical readings, an intersection of poetics and ethics, and the Sensing Salon with Valentina Desideri. She's also a playwright. She's worked with Ross Martin to create Return of the Vanishing Peasant. And she's created and is in progress on multiple films, which she's in collaboration with Arjuna Newman, notably Serpent Rain from 2016, and more recently, Four Waters Deep Implicancy 2018. And she's exhibited her artwork at Pompidou Center Paris, Whitechapel Gallery London, MASP Sao Paulo, Guggenheim New York, and MoMA in New York City. I could list many more accolades, but let me end today by saying that Dr. Denise Ferreira de Silva is a philosopher, a deep thinker, an artist, and someone who attends to the myriad of societal changes we face today in such a creative fashion that ranges from tarot card reading, to poetry, to playwriting, to cinema, to particle physics. And it is a deep honor to have her here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Erin, for this very generous introduction, and for the invitation to speak to the lecture series in the program Environmental Futures. And I should say that I live and work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. And more particularly, I live in the reservation itself, which is a very beautiful place and remains beautiful in spite and perhaps because of the resistance to the ongoing colonial and racial violence, of which, of course, CBC is also part. But I'm very, very thankful for their hospitality as I do my work and my thinking from here, right, from Musqueam land. The title of my presentation, as I was showing before, is Deep Implicancy. And before I start, I just want to say very briefly how this presentation will move, because it will move in steps that will not be introduced from the outset. So I ask you to be patient as the argument unfolds. Actually, to be more precise, it doesn't so much unfold as I just move and take you with me through a little through a path. I mean, or a point of encounter of many paths. I was going to open with a poem, but I think I'll just get it started. So my guiding question is, how, in face of so many catastrophes, can we possibly identify one single statement with which or from which to begin a critical analysis of the global present, and also the kind of reorientation of thinking it seems to demand? My starting point is, as some of you may know, decolonization. That is the restoration of the total value expropriated from native lands and slave labor. Why is decolonization the only possible signified for anything that can be taken as a descriptor for what so many mean through, under the name of justice, social justice, or global justice. So why decolonization? Well, decolonization because as a demand, it hosts the most urgent ethical-political issues of our time. Because at first, throughout, and at last, the global issues that preoccupy us recall colonial and racial subjugation. Which issues are those? Well, let me mention four. First, there is this ongoing juridical economic strategy, which I'll call criminality now, this moment. So this decades-long juridical practice, which takes the form of increasing rates of incarceration and of instances of state and state-authorized killings, all justified by criminality, criminalization of the gangbanger, or the figures of the terrorists, or in the figure of the illegal immigrant, and facilitated by private economic entities, be that prisons, detention centers, the war mercenaries, and the builders of walls. So I'm referring here to Black and Latinx persons in the US, but also to Muslim populations everywhere, whether in the war zones in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, or in the African continent. And I'm also referring to drug-related armed conflicts throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'm speaking about what's taking place in North America, but also what's taking place elsewhere and how they're fundamentally linked. But the second and related, that is the unprecedented displacement of populations in the global South, Europe's refugee crisis, of which we have taken notice, or we have been taking notice since about 5 years ago, but which have been going on for much longer. For this crisis is related to the same local and regional wars that I mentioned before, armed conflicts that do not interfere with labor expropriation and seem to facilitate further land expropriation and extractions of minerals, which are so dear to capital. This crisis is inseparable from the devastation of livelihood provoked by the latest economic development strategies, which seem to be the returning the economies of the global South to a focus on extractivism and agriculture. But this time around, these activities are in the hands of otherwise or otherwise related to multinational corporations. Let's not forget Europeans' response to this, that Europeans' response to this refugee crisis, which has been causing the death of so many brown Black persons from former European colonies. The response has been the consolidation of the corporate security state and the return of lethal white identity politics there and elsewhere. So thirdly, that is this latest global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, which true to form in less than 1 year has proved deadlier to Black, Latinx, and indigenous populations of North America, and will for sure wreak havoc in the former colonies of the global South. Finally, fourthly, but throughout and no less dramatic in its expressions, and I'm thinking here about the recent fires in the West Coast, and also I know that around Boulder, Colorado, there is global warming, and more importantly, our sheer incapacity to make sense and to think it in the ways that it should be. Thinking, I find that takes into account all four developments: criminality, refugee crisis, the pandemic, and global warming. Thinking that locates them jointly, unfolding the global context, must, I find, begin with the view that decolonization is the only relevant ethical principle for our times. Why is this the case? Well, both that the connection between these four issues is given immediately and that decolonization is the only appropriate political response to them. There are, I'm sure many reasons why that's the case. Here I'll comment on one, which is the least straightforward because it is, I think, counterintuitive. It is that the prevailing logics for arguments for anything that could be taken as substantive, meaning corrective and not only protective justice, and by that I mean social and global justice, these are distribution and recognition. Of course, I don't have time to revisit neither John Rawls' theory of distributive justice, nor Charles Taylor's articulation of recognition as the principle under multiculturalism, nor can I engage with their critics. But I can mention that the sharpest critiques begin precisely with the shifting attention to social subjugation, that is to gender, racial, sexual subjugation. And here I have in mind the work of Iris Marion Young, such as her book, Justice and the Politics of Difference, and also shifting attention to colonial subjugation. And here I have in mind Glenn Coulthard's Red Skin, White Masks, in which he unleashes a very sharp critique of recognition, among other things. Okay, so this may sound like a footnote, but it works actually as a shortcut for the point I'm trying to bring about, which is a level at which the shifting in thinking needs to take place. And if we are obviously to attend to the demand for decolonization and appreciate its ethical force. So this move, and I have been claiming for a while now, includes a description of existence that attends to deep implicancy, but also its corresponding image of existence, for which I use the phrase corpus infinitum. So I'm not going to define those two in this presentation. I'm just going to recall that deep implicancy can be related to what we would call an onto-existential level, and corpus infinitum corresponds to what could be called an onto-metaphysical level. So, and then one could reply by saying that the ontological and the metaphysical should not be distinguished, and that whatever existential is supposed to mean, it should not be so intimately tied to the ontological, and those are valid points. But what I'm proposing can be seen really as violating some of basic premises of Western philosophy, including that one. So point taken. In particular, what I'm doing and what I'm proposing is presenting deep implicancy as a departure from phenomenology and its redeployment of the transparent I, Husserl's pure I, as well as its reinscription of its separation and its capacity for apprehending something that is called world. So that Heidegger, Sartre, and others would follow with ontological considerations that begin with existence makes perfect sense. So deep implicancy responds to that, as well as to the refiguring of the transparent I as subjectivity, which is a gift from phenomenology. Similarly, corpus infinitum responds to a figuring of the transparent I, the figure of the I think, which is designed in separation from something that is called nature. And I place this response, in the moment where the theme of ontology is a reference to the metaphysical, because this is a level at which, or maybe this is the level at which Immanuel Kant positions the account of knowledge, in which he introduces the I think, as well as the theme of the transcendental. So my plan for this presentation is, as the title indicates, to introduce deep implicancy. But because it is a correspondence to corpus infinitum, meaning body without limits, I begin by mentioning to you an experiment that comments on the latter. And then in the second part, I will present deep implicancy through a commentary on the Anthropocene and on artworks in which I find an invitation for thinking, or an invitation to think it otherwise. First moment, the experiments. So these are it's a brief note on corpus infinitum. So just to give you a sense of the kind of shifting thinking I have in mind. And I usually present it in the form of a two-part experiment. One part considers unity and the other considers infinity. Since this is a presentation, sorry, I'm just doing my screen sharing. Since this presentation is not on corpus infinitum, but only on its corresponding description of existence, deep implicancy, I'm going to react to the main points of the experiment, which is to show how an abstract rendering of circumscription sustains the I think as the figure that provides the onto-metaphysical and onto-existential grounds for the ruling post-enlightenment ethical figures, meaning humanity and subjectivity, and ruling ethical principles, meaning liberty and equality. So the first part of that experiment basically shows how necessity supports the claims to certainty. And these are attached to the Kantian I think and the image of existence that accompanies it, which is nature. So the image I use for that is the image of a circle, giving the sense of circumscription. And then I go about connecting dots, etc. So that's the image for the first part of the experiment. And the image for the second part of the experiment, okay, those are the dots. Oh, okay. Okay, the second part of the experiment is the sphere. So you've seen them, and I will just proceed. So in regards to the first part of the experiment, we find that necessity is evident when one considers how, if one begins with something limited somehow, right, a space or a shape, something with boundaries, and then tries to connect what's included in it, but separate, right, like those dots, some things will happen regardless of one's intention. Such as if for instance, if I try to connect points on opposite sides of this circle, if I go through the center, I'll always, every time I go through the center of the circle, I'll draw a straight line. And then if I try to avoid the circle, every time I try to avoid the circle while trying to connect points on opposite sides, I'm going to draw a curved line, always necessarily. This so much so that it is possible to describe both the lines of connection and the positions of what is inside using mathematical formulas, such as the one for the circle and the same circle, without even having to draw or image the things. Now, the second part of the experiment, as I said, it images infinity with the same context, but now the focus is not on circumscription, but on composition. So instead of trying to connect its components, the task is to describe what happens to the gaps between them when they vibrate, move without dislocating. What happens in the gap, even when they do not vibrate, actually, as we know, is transfer of energy, of potential energy, chemical, or in the form of chemical or gravitational energy that is labeled when they move, or in the form of kinetical energy called calor when they do not move. Transfer of energy may or may not involve transduction or the conversion of one form of energy into another, such as chemical energy from fossil fuel being transducted into kinetic energy through the car engine, or the microphone, which converts sound to electricity, and the speaker, which converts electrical signals back into sound. So those are all examples of transduction, which is a form of transfer of energy. But then, of course, transfer of energy is also formalized both classically and quantically. But my focus here, however, is not on formalization, but on how the second experiment involves existence. That is an attention to things that address their relations in terms of what happens to them, how they affect each other, and not how they are positioned in relation to one another or how they are located in a given context. So you may be wondering why this experiment, and of course I have reasons. I have many reasons. Among the most important is obviously a desire to release the Kantian hold over our imagination, which is sine qua non for releasing thinking from the hold of the pair necessity liberty. In particular, I target what Kant calls the a priori principle that underlies his whole enterprise. That is his framework for scientific knowledge for the static and ethical program. And then again, I don't have time to make a case for how the Kantian program has come to constitute post-enlightenment thinking and our thinking, for that matter, not to spell out how it's to, none of that. All I can do is again recall how not only Husserl's formulation of phenomenology draw from the Kantian figuring of the subject in the I thinking, but Marx also deployed the Kantian framework for scientific knowledge in assembling the tools that show how wage labor determines, explains, and creates produced capital, both in terms of its historical social conditions, but also in the very moment of economic production of value. So what is this principle? Kant calls it the law of specification of nature, which is the a priori principle that guides, according to him, obviously, the power of judgment. That is the mental capacity involved in the determination, meaning the subsumption of a particular under universal concept or category, and also in reflection, which is a consideration of something that does not, at least immediately, relate it to a universal. So let me just quote from his critique of judgment. So this principle, according to him, quote, assumes in behalf of an order of nature cognizable for our understanding in the division that it makes of its universal laws when it would subordinate a manifold of particular laws to these. That is, individual human beings basically will go about existence under this principle. So everything, events and existence we encounter is assumed to be part of an order, of a context informed by the universal laws through which our understanding knows. That is, before scientific tools and procedures are deployed, we presume that all that exists constitutes a unified and ordered whole according to universal laws. Or another way of saying it is that existence is the site of necessity. However, because necessity in the form of law is something that belongs to the understanding and accounts for its capacity to determine, to subsume particulars under universals, which is basically the task of scientific knowledge for Kant, the subject of knowledge is not submitted to it. And that's where the theme of liberty comes about. So let me just go back to the experiment for a second. So my objective with the experiment was to exemplify two distinct exercises that obtain abstraction in a way that allows me to comment on necessity and determinacy. In the first part, I highlight the immediacy of necessitation, and then in the second part, I highlight its belatedness. In both, I comment on the possibility of determination, but then in the second, I talk about its delay. The first part figures Kant's postulate that mathematical statements yield judgments a priori, that is, that they allow for a statement that adds something what happens and what exists in the world, but that it does so they do so intuitively. Now, the second part of the exercise adds something which Kant would call a posteriori, that is something that recalls existence. So the vibrating dots can be image, but it is impossible to describe what happens in the surrounding gaps without recalling what happens when energy release takes place, when something dislocates or vibrates. Still, the second part of the experiment refers to and yields abstraction as much as the first one, but it presumes obviously a different image of existence, which I call corpus infinitum. Now, this image corpus infinitum recalls Leibniz's notion of the plenum, but it is slightly modified by thermodynamics and the weird things, findings of quantum physics, both particle physics and then quantum field theory, and a little bit also by condensed matter physics. So to give you an idea, let's just compare Leibniz's description of the plenum and then the Kantian presentation of the I think. So I had help here. Let's see if this works. Aaron, if you can hear it, just say this, okay? Let's see, where did it go? Can you hear?
For everything is a plenum, which makes all matter interconnected. In a plenum, every motion has some effect on distant bodies in proportion to their distance. For each body is affected, not only by those in contact with it, and in some way feels the effects of everything that happens to them, but also through them. It feels the effects of those in contact with the bodies with which it is itself immediately in contact. From this, it follows that this communication extends to any distance whatsoever. As a result, everybody is affected by everything that happens in the universe, to such an extent that he who sees all can read in each thing what happens everywhere, and even what has happened or what will happen by observing in the present what is remote in time as well as in space.
And now the Kantian, I think.
If it is thus conceded that one must go beyond a given concept in order to compare it synthetically with another, then a third thing is necessary in which alone the synthesis of the two concepts can originate. But now, what is this third thing as the medium of all synthetic judgments? There is only one totality in which all of our representations are contained, namely inner sense and its a priori form, time. The synthesis of representations rests on the imagination, but their synthetic unity, which is requisite for judgment, on the unity of apperception. Herein, therefore, is to be thought the possibility of synthetic judgments, and since all three contain the source of a priori representations, also the possibility of pure synthetic judgments. Indeed, on these grounds, they will even be necessary if a cognition of objects is to come about, which rests solely on the synthesis of representations.
With corpus infinitum, I propose an image of existence that does not need the I think, the transparent, transcendental I, also known as subject, objectivity, humanity. The figure is a figure is so deeply entrenched in notions such as nature, Kant's ordered whole, and even world in its phenomenological rendering. So back to my experiment once again. I imaged dots twice. First with a line connecting them, and then the second they were vibrating. The whole experiment appeals to the imagination. However, the first part relies on the intuition, and the second, as I said before, recalls existence. I did that because something happens with dots when they stop being fixed points on a plane, when they become bits of dust inside of a sphere. When they come into existence, whatever happens to the dots cannot be totally described formally. I think is not so quickly recalled in the second part of the experiment, because as an image of existence, corpus infinitum, which is just as abstract as this plane you see now, have which is those figures that since Galileo have supported the claim of modern philosophers, especially when they are translated into mathematical demonstrations, proofs, but corpus infinitum does not picture an abstract delimited space, which always presumes a center. However, instead of fitting in the Cartesian plane, it pictures an image, it pictures existence as a full but unlimited context, without a center presumed or marked, and one in which that which exists is connected to everything else, not through a line, but through its mode of existing, such as the vibrating dots that release the internal kinetic energy as heat, or constitutive chemical potential energy as labor into the gaps. And this energy is then absorbed, refracted, or diffracted by other dots, but does not go anywhere. Without the I think and its object, that is nature, and without subjectivity and its world, this image of existence obtains deep implicancy. An onto-existential descriptor, as an onto-existential descriptor, deep implicancy refigures the ordered world in such a way that not only decenters the human and its separation from all other existence, but it also reorients how space and time and linearity, and the linearity presupposed in them enters in the accounts of existence. So let me move now to the second moment of this presentation and share with you two instances of work that to me recall deep implicancy. And my dear friend Suzanne Winterling will help again, but now talking about her work.
Planetary sensing is a project, a node project. Nodes are meeting lines in mathematical representation. It also is like a grid in digital modeling and 3D animation. It's not so easy in 2 minutes to say like how this came about. I actually don't know. I have been fascinated by bioluminescence maybe 15 years ago because I had some friends who were originally from Puerto Rico, emigrated to Florida, told me a little bit about it, and then I kind of like thought that this is like the ultimum, the absolute artwork that no one else can do something like that. My laboratory experiments were kind of a little bit stupid maybe, and once I recognized that I have to go to places, and I started meeting people. First I only wanted to meet the microorganisms, but I started meeting people, especially fishermen, and I recognized this is not just about this magic that maybe triggered the whole thing, but that I have to do something else, that I have to do more. I cannot just like say like, oh, this is great and this is art, and then see all the misery and the trouble around. One of the fishermen, actually Pedro, I think he was one of the starting triggers, because he thought that I would be maybe a journalist and that I actually could help him fighting against the leftovers of the military occupation in Puerto Rico, Vieques, where he and his family were living from fishing since I don't know how many 100 years. And that kind of like hit me in a way. The whole recording was nearly vanished and broken afterwards. But as an experience, we really had a lot of difficulties understanding each other. He had like two friends who helped him translate from Haiti, and they were like really good in English because my Spanish is very bad, actually not existing. Anyway, it's very difficult why to say like why I keep going. Maybe it's not like a real reason. Maybe it has to do with my grandmother. Maybe it has to do with like experiences in my past. But it also is like a sort of stubbornness in facing so many violent things and still being like struck by something that's like way beyond human for sure, way beyond maybe this planet, and that this something that maybe keeps us going, maybe made the microorganisms, the dinoflagellates reach out for me, capture me, and make me their ambassador. Rights of nature is also like...
Okay, I'll stop here. So Suzanne's project, Planetary Sensing, is one of many, but at least one of the two artworks I will mention here as where I think I find a call or something that recalls deep implicancy, even though it's not immediately defined along those lines. But let me just move, I'm close to the end here, and let me try to bring this account of being a connection between colonization and associate demand for decolonization to the thinking about global warming. More particularly, I have to say that I'm interested in how to think what is to be captured, supposed to be captured under terms such as the Anthropocene and Capitalocene, but think about it in a different way, in a way which does not reinstitute the I think, even if in the unlikable image of the anthropos. Let me begin by noting how the very procedure for naming the ages of Earth, which, like a good issue of the Kantian program, inscribes linear time, it also maps the I think onto the surface onto the whole planet, actually. So this name procedure is both, of course, a bit too obvious, but it's also extremely difficult to see because it makes so much sense. So existing techniques and tools set the age of the planet 4.6 billion years, and the first 600 million years are not yet officially named, it seems, because of the lack of evidence, life of bacteria more exactly, that allowed for the naming of the other 4 billion years. What we usually ignore is that I think governs this name procedure because it employs the methods, concepts, and formulation of the sense of life. And with two relevant consequences. First, the biological classificatory system Cuvier designed in the early 19th century already presumes that the human organic forms govern the understanding of the forms and functions of other living things, and it is a superior one. And second, and consequently, that when deployed by geologists, it maps human condition onto the planet. So the unofficial phases, layers of the planet are so because they cannot be separated according to the living things, which are on their turn knowable because of the different degrees of complexity of their organisms, which allow for the determination of their genera, species, etc., which is basically taking us to Kant's law of specification all the way. And then, of course, these also have allowed the establishing, it allows for the establishing of their places in the temporal sequence that charts development progress of life in a figuring which is closer to something else that I don't want to get into. But my point is primarily that when critics of the Anthropocene charge anthropocentrism, it is a belated gesture which does not quite get to the root of the problem. As I mentioned before, the Kantian image of the ordered world positions there, I think, in the very interstructures of everything, because it is the ground for which anything can be described, provide the grounds for the description of anything. For this reason, deep implicancy and the related image of infinity, I propose, would support the placing of the colonization at the core of thinking about global warming and how to stop it. And also about, in terms of how to address its effects, that's what I mean, assuming that, may be reversible, who knows, probably not. So how the colonization provides us with an ethical basis for demanding the kind of juridic and economic changes necessary for challenge the dominance of state capital, and that also inspired, and how it inspires a sensibility that also included shift of gears, that is go away from extraction of lands and resources, and also, the extraction that results in the displacement, dispossession, and that forces racial orders of Europe to leave their homes. Is a preoccupation in here. So to me, the main step, of course, is shift the focus from the human anthropos as the efficient cause of global warming, and highlight extraction and the juridical and symbolic modes of deployment that facilitated, meaning coloniality and raciality. So yes, human actions are leading to the temperature rise that will cause the destruction and extinction of human and other living things. The food we eat, the fossil fuel used in our vehicles are culprit in this flow. Global warming is also about heat, the transfer of kinetic energy generated by collisions of the constituents of a given existence. Heat, calor, flows from flesh to flesh by contact, radiation, or mediation. And then every existing thing, as I mentioned before, radiates at the infrared level as long as the temperature is above absolute zero. So internal kinetic energy, calor, depends on the mass and speed, and then like any other form of energy, it can be transformed into another kind of form of energy through conversion or transduction. So let me, actually I want to go there. So let me introduce this with comments, and then also close this with comments on labor and on land and labor, in particular in reference to colonial subjugation. So land, including the waters and other more than human inhabitants, exist as potential energy, as chemical, gravitational, other forms of energy. So reflecting about Maria Teresa Alves' work, in particular about the return of the lake and its commitment not to let what has happened to disappear in the flow of linear time, I have been thinking about and against the abstract linearity of time and why it's so crucial, not only for contending with European conquest and settlement of the Americas, that is colonialism. Time is crucial also for contending with the reverberations of this never-ending act, as Maria Teresa work shows. That is the colonial act, right? The act of theft. Every colonial act is theft. Colonialism is ongoing, timeless theft. she proposes. How to think in such a way that violates this linear separation and progression. Well, back to my proposal. We can think about how the equivalence between matter and energy presented by Einstein materialized in the bombs tested in the Marshall Islands. Well, that can be hijacked and repurposed too. And I see it as being about, again, this description of existence that does not presume separability, that is about deep implicancy. So if thinking begins in such a way, then it is possible to think both at the same time that yes, the water of the Lake Chalco has been extracted, but the Hico community's claim to that water is not only a claim to possession, but theirs is an ancestral claim. They are the water, bodies composed by water, and also by everything that grew in the community because of the water of the lake, the plants, the fishes, the birds. So it's also possible to think that what has been extracted has not disappeared in consumption. Actually, if we think in terms of phase transitions, and then also in terms of transduction, shifting from one form of energy into another, then we can consider that how their ancestors' bodies were composed by what grew because of this water. So when the water was extracted, parts of them were taken elsewhere. That is their claim, and that cannot be measured because that's their claim, and that cannot be measured because it is in everything. That means that we think two things at the same time. First, extraction and total violence that enables it, the ongoing theft and economic dispossession. And second, what I call decomposition, which needs a description, deep implicancy as a description, which is the fact that the water remains physically as their bodies, the trees and other things that exist in Hico because the lake had been there. What I'm saying is that we can think that the wealth that has been accumulated by the descendants of the occupiers, of the settler of those lands in Mexico, the wealth that was sent back to Europe in the form of objects, but also of raw materials, and that entered in the initial accumulation of capital as industrial capital, stolen wealth that has been transformed in so many ways is also composed of that water, Lake Chalco's water. What has been extracted remains transduced into money in Europe and now into these virtual financial objects that prevail in global capital. So if we take both into account, then we can think of the return of the lake along different lines. It's not the return of a possession. It is the return of a constitutive part of the community that can be monetized. It is also because the wealth yielded by what was extracted enters in the composition of what exists not only in Europe, but everywhere. The return is also a homecoming of sorts. It is the actualization of a deep implication that already exists. So it cannot be monetized. It cannot be calculated and resolved as loss or as a kind of gain. So what I'm trying to get at is that thinking without the separations of linearity and ways of creating meaning it imposes and permits can give us another appreciation of indigenous people's calls for decolonization and Black folks' calls, demand for reparations. What has been demanded is a return of something that has never completely disappeared, but which has also made them as part of all that exists. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We'll open up the floor now to questions. If you can send those to the hosts, then we will convey those to Denise. But while we're waiting for those to come in, I thought I would ask kind of follow-up question to that closing end portion of your lecture, which I'm so intrigued with that idea of the return of and the enmeshment and the entanglement of matter with place, and that bodies are of the river and of the land. And yet I'm also stymied by the way in which the human population has grown to such an extent. And I wonder if you might comment on what that means globally for our planet as human population has grown. And in order for that growth to have occurred, we've used so many other, if we're thinking about transference and transformation of matter and material, so much of that growth has depended upon the loss of other non-human species, fish being eaten, animals being eaten, that kind of thing. I wonder if you might comment on that. I realize it's a little bit of a tangent, but I'm interested in that idea and your history and work on matter, and how you might respond to that.
Yes, I think we should be able to think it away from the most conservative arguments that can be advanced when you begin to think about population growth and the demands for population control, and that we usually go back to the global south, right? So I see the question as an invitation to think that through and then away from that particular line of thinking, which has all kinds of problems and describes, strategies of symbolic violence. So this thinking is talking about global warming through both energy conversion, but also phase transition. The initial moment the initial piece I wrote along those lines, I was thinking about excess, right? Which I'll connect to population growth at some point. But the excess accumulation, the excess expropriation and accumulation that, from colonialism through industrialization, now it's materialized in the excess of these greenhouse gases and in the troposphere. So that was my initial thought. So but then, and that bringing about global warming. But then on the other hand, we also know that these, especially during industrialization, this maybe second moment, when capital was so dependent on labor, on human labor, then this extraction and it relied so much, perhaps not as much on extraction as it did in the previous phase, but that definitely on the expropriation of labor, but an expropriation of labor that needed the human, but then at the same time that the humans whose labor were expropriated, always living very close to death, right? I mean, in very precarious situations. So I believe that we can use the same argument regarding regarding the extraction and accumulation of gases to advance a proposition that not so much link the size of the human population to a consumption that generates leads to the accumulation of gas and leading to global warming, because that would be the efficient causality, but actually translating, before going that other way, translating that looking at the expropriated labor, from the labor expropriated from that excess population and how it translates into wealth that then is deposited, right? So the problem is not the excess population. The problem is the extraction of labor that is converted in wealth that then is further invested in machines or in further extraction or in abstract economic to entities like subprime loan, whatever, or mortgage-based loans that then allows for further accumulation of wealth. So I in trying to avoid efficient cause, I think that the tracing of the material transformation, at the beginning with the material capacity in the bodies of the people in the global south, the material capacity being, labor itself, but it's a material capacity in terms of it being, the body being transformed into something else, into a, whether agricultural or industrial. I think that's what needs to be traced, because if we trace at that level, then you make an argument both for decolonization, and you make an argument again, and then we make an argument that describes the conditions that bring about global warming without blaming it on the people whose existence have been, how do I say that, made possible by the numbers, made possible in such numbers precisely because at some point capital needed that labor. Now they don't need it anymore, right? And now you're finding in all of these regions, those are the same regions where we have, we have different kinds of armed conflicts, whether they are wars or they are disputes involving gang members, or we just have the police coming and deploying total violence. So I think I did answer your question.
You did, thank you. And we have a couple here from Renata Barreto. Professor De Silva, could you put the corpus infinitum in relation to your three descriptors of virtuality, namely traversability, transversability, and transubstantiality?
Yes, I can, because, but it is a short and a long answer. I have a few descriptions of corpus infinitum. One was this experiment with the shear and looking at the and thinking about the vibrating dot, but a corresponding descriptor is it's a figure that is difficult to explain, but is a quantum field theory figure of an electron and its self-energy. So the electron in quantum field theory, the particles, they are excitations in a field. So the electron is there in the electromagnetic field, but those excitations, so the electron exists, but it also exists both because of the operation of virtual particles, but in that relationship to the virtual particles, the electron generates its own energy. It is an equation that I don't have it here, but basically the idea is that while there is one electron, its self-energy is infinite. So they have this renormalization formulas that make it all Newtonian and everything is fine. But now one presentation of that quantum entity is 1 plus infinity. So 1 plus infinity means that something is one singular, and then at the same time it is infinite. With corpus infinitum, and that infinite is obviously, has to do obviously with the impossibility of shutting down that calculation. That is, I think, makes physicists crazy. But in my mind, that infinity also takes into account the effects of entanglement, which are beyond, the lines of, which violate the lines of space and time. So traversability, transubstantiality are, for me, descriptors of possibilities that can be captured if you think of everything that exists and happens as one singular redecomposition of that which also enters in the composition of everything else with infinite. So it's one, but it's one always plus infinity. And then if you think along those lines, then it is possible to describe existence by taking into account both the actuality, which let's call it the one, and the possibility and the virtuality that it is in plus infinity, that anything or anything, existing or anything happening could also, and is also in a way, possibly and virtually otherwise, right? And that otherwise is a statement that does two things. On the one hand, acknowledges the line. So these three terms that I use that I mentioned toward the Black feminist poetics, they're important because there is an acknowledgement of the lines, but then at the same time, there is an acknowledgement of the possibility that it is beyond the line, and it's all happening at the same time. So corpus infinitum carries also, that other possible description.
Thank you for that. Could you recommend writings for further study? This is a question from Janine Thornton.
Study of?
It says, a further study beyond your presentation. You've already cited many folks. Yeah, maybe Janine, you could clarify whether you're thinking of artists or
physicists or
philosophers, etc. Artists in particular is the question.
Okay, for yeah, it's like but thinking in terms of Janine, why Janine, can you speak?
Can we unmute Janine? Yes, Bonnie will do that for us.
Thank you.
If you're comfortable speaking, Janine, you may.
There we go. Oops. Unmute. There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I was particularly fascinated by your discussion on the corpus infinitum. A lot of the work that I do deals with interconnection. And so I was wondering if you had some recommendations of things that I could look into further that kind of expanded on these ideas of the corpus infinitum and the plenum in particular.
Okay, thank you for speaking up, Janine. So I'll type it here for, I don't know, please, I'll do it for everyone. So, okay, for corpus infinitum is something that I am devising. So the book I'm finishing now, which is coming out on MIT Press Stanford. The title is Unpayable Debt, and it will be out next year. So on the plenum, Leibniz discourse on it's spelled discourse on metaphysics. Okay, still not physics. Okay. Let's see. And then of my pieces, that is the On Difference Without Separability. And then, yeah. And then you can write me. How is it? I forgot my SJI director. No, wait. cdc.ca. And then I'll send you more.
Okay, we have a question from Miguel Rojas Sotelo. Miguel, would you like to ask your question directly? Or would you prefer that I read it? He doesn't have a mic. Okay, I will ask it. As the Anthropocene matches the Capitalocene from your perspective, as well as the one of decolonial theory, the recognition of a system or production of society, industrial to post-industrial, the technosphere, that is unsustainable due to the limits of the natural systems that sustain life as we know it. It opens up a question and a discussion of post-human horizon. Could you comment on that? As Black and Indigenous peoples have been outside of the humanitarian discourse under modernity, coloniality, including in and due to science. As we move to mine the moon and actively into Mars, which you talked a little bit about yesterday in the grad seminar, exporting the extractive model, no one of the terraformation, but homoformation of celestial bodies, how to use your discourse to correct that course of action. And if no reparation can be made to Black and Indigenous people under the status quo, what can we expect?
Yeah, I think I have to say, Miguel, that I completely agree with your analysis. So basically, I cannot so much answer the question, but just offer more further commentary. And that's where I am. I'm usually accused of being a pessimist. But I think I'm an optimist, because I think we can really change the way, not only change the way we think, because that's not that difficult, but actually, I think we can really release our imagination from precisely the kind of this image of existence that naturalize extraction and naturalize conquest, because how else can you explain these ventures in Mars and the moon? Then, like, they didn't learn anything in 500 years? Seriously? What do they think they're going to get to? So we need to shift both, right, how we think, which takes into account how we come before, how we stand before everything that exists, and place the human in there. So I don't know that if it is post-human. I mean, I understand the post-human move. I understand the critique. I appreciate the critique. Probably share a lot with them. But as in the case of the diagnosis of the Anthropocene, I don't think it takes us anywhere, really. So in my pessimist optimist point of view, I think that what we need to live in the world differently. And as we talked yesterday and today, it's implied that it's not like there are no ways of thinking and imagining how we are in the world differently. Folks here in North America, in the African continent, in the Pacific, everywhere indigenous populations have had for millennia. They have different ontologies, different accounts of existence that place the human differently. So there are those. So what I'm doing is just trying to destroy the European one from within. That's all my contribution. That's all I can do, because I was actually very well trained to do that. So I'm trying to do that. But more importantly, we have to live in this world differently, right? And that's a difficult task, because it asks us to do a few things. One of them is maybe to accept the fact that, and then thinking about all the demands for inclusion and all different demands made by racialized and indigenous populations, that we need to abandon that demand for decolonization or the anti-racist demand is not for inclusion within this model that is destroying everything, and then take upon ourselves the task of living in the world differently, and lose a lot, you know, which makes it very difficult, knowing that not only materially, but also emotionally, the emotional affective investment we have in living under those conditions, we will have to relinquish it. So it is obviously a critical element intellectually. That is a critical element. That is a political element that it's not defined to be defined by the state, because state capital have always worked together. So it's a political element that recalls the old revolutionary impulse. But I'm also thinking more along the lines of the self-organized anarchist models, right? So there is an existential aspect, which is we have to live differently, even though we live under these two conditions. And there is a creative aspect. I mean, there are different levels at which, yeah.
Miguel has written that he agrees, and that maybe Arturo Escobar with his pluriversal politics might help. And he says, well done, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, okay, I have a comment on Escobar, but we can just go. But maybe,
Please.
As long as it doesn't become cultural difference all over again. But anyway.
I have another question about, could you talk a little more about the relation between phenomenology and the transparent eye?
I can talk about it briefly, which is something that I developed in this new book, about that. And it's very simple. So if you take Ideas 1, which is one of Husserl's main books in phenomenology, but Ideas 1 actually introduced the concept. You see that both the description of what he calls a natural attitude and the description of what he calls the phenomenological entity, which is the pure I, they're both Kantian, they're both formal, but in contradistinction with the Kantian formulation of the pure I, and it has to be distinct because Husserl is writing over 100 years later and after Hegel. The image of the pure I that he introduces is the one that takes the characteristic of an essence, which already knows before any kind of actual engagement, which already knows, and it has the ability to know. Sorry, I dropped something. The essence of everything else. So subjectivity, the theme of subjectivity that is introduced, that theme appears in Kant, it's there in Hegel, but in Hegel it is subsumed by a collective subjectivity, the nation. And then in phenomenology and then existentialism, all this, 20th century philosophy, it takes the shape of subjectivity. That entity is modeled after the I think, but not the I think as a subject of knowledge, but the I think as a subject in the world. Not because the I think can apprehend the world to think with its tools, but because the I think exists, the conditions of existence of that pure I are also the parameters for the delineation of something that it's called a world, time and space, right? Space and time. But it all happens a priori, it all happens, formally. And then you find the I, particular individual subjectivity, dealing with the world in their like micro actual existence. But the conditions of possibility for having a world are given a priori, not formally, though a case could be made that it's kind of, but not necessarily formal, but definitely a priori.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we have come to the end of our time together. We're so grateful. Thank you so much, Dr. De Silva, for the time today, for the presentation. And we're so happy to have you here and thinking along these lines with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and the questions.